Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another video with Swaggle. And in this video, we have to talk about how BATGIRL has been canceled. Yes, of course, the big news. I'm sure you guys have all heard about it. And in this video, we got to ask ourselves the question, what is going on with DC? What is going on with Warner Brothers? And maybe, for the people out there who are watching this video, what you're most concerned about is what's going to happen to your Detective Comics 359. So in this video, we're going to talk about how maybe bad movies can hurt your books, and that ultimately, this might be a good thing if you're a BATGIRL fan. But before I get into the video, if you guys could drop me a like or a comment or subscribe if you're enjoying the content, helps support the channel, doing those things, I would appreciate it. But let us get into this video here today. And of course, this is something that I have been thinking about a lot, and especially coming off the heels of some of the Marvel Phase 4 we've been seeing, how a lot of properties have actually been hurting the values of certain comic books. I mean, certainly after, we get movies or TV shows, there's always a pullback, there's always a correction once the hype dies down for a certain character or a certain book. But it feels like even more and more with the negativity surrounding certain properties, that can really have an effect on the value of a book, even more so than what it should have an effect on, where, we're starting to see certain prices of certain books even drop down lower than that of which they were selling before the property even existed, which doesn't really make any sense in terms of, what collectors' feelings are towards a particular comic book, unless, of course, the brand is actually getting hurt by the film. So that's one of the things I think is really interesting when we're talking about this BATGIRL situation. Apparently, this movie tested so poorly that, they were unwilling to release it, and that Zaslav wants to protect the brand of DC. So let's kind of get into this news here today and talk about some of the values. And I kind of want to point to a couple different examples of books that we've seen in this current, market where, the values of them have sort of dropped off after the fact due to the reception of the film. And we'll talk about how maybe this is ultimately a good thing for the BATGIRL character. So of course, the news that I'm sure you guys all know is that, HBO has announced, or DC has announced, that they're canceling the BATGIRL film. This is something that is coming off of the heels of, the corporate restructuring that Discovery had purchased Warner Brothers. I also know a couple other behind the scenes things where I think there's a struggle in terms of the creative and the continuity that they're exploring, and that the BATGIRL film doesn't really work with the direction that they want to go in. So there's a lot of problems behind the scenes, and ultimately that led to the cancellation of this film. Additionally, we have, executives like Walter Hamada, who's on the way out probably. We have Alan Horn coming from Marvel into DC. So there's been a massive, massive restructuring. And ultimately, I think that this actually could be a really good thing in terms of, we as collectors enjoying these films and also protecting the values of our books. Now, it does kind of call into question that, you should never really be buying books strictly based off of the success of films, but certainly they're going to have a factor in our FOMO. It's going to play a role in what we want to collect. That's just the way that this thing works. I mean, we all are susceptible to being converted into fans and thus wanting to collect a certain type of character or a certain type of book after a movie or a TV show. It's just, how we are built as humans. So this is all going to have an effect. And I think it's really interesting because, it is something that we are seeing in the current market, and how, if this is actually true, that the BATGIRL film was actually so bad that it tested so poorly with audiences that they were worried that it was going to destroy the brand. This is actually a good thing that they're canceling this film if you are someone out there who is a holder of Detective Comics number 359. Now, of course, Detective Comics 359 is the first appearance of Barbara Gordon, BATGIRL. So this would be the book that would sort of be the marquee book that people would be looking to spec on or invest in coming off the heels of this movie. And if I'm thinking about the value of where this book sits in the market, I would definitely say that this is a good book to invest in or a good book to pick up, simply due to the fact that this is one of the attainable top tier DC characters you can get. I mean, we all know that a lot of the DC books that have the first appearances mostly consist of Golden Age books that are out of reach for a lot of us. But Barbara Gordon BATGIRL is a 1966 books. It's a Silver Age book. It's something that is actually attainable. And, if we take a look at some of the numbers here, I like to always go to, the grade that has the higher census so that we can get like the best, understanding of where the values have gone. We've seen this book, slowly creep up over the years. Like certainly it's had, peaks and valleys and peaks and valleys. It's got its 2021 boom. It had its excitement, and, it's definitely having its pullback in this current, kind of economic state that we're in. And it'll be interesting to see where this book goes now coming off of the heels of this announcement. But this is a book that was sort of primed to, be able to sort of establish a new floor for itself. I mean, I'm sure after the film, we would have had a pullback and a correction like we normally see with a lot of books, but being that it's a Silver Age 1966 book, I mean, this could have definitely gone one of two different ways. And I kind of want to show you guys where that could potentially go as I show you guys some different examples. But I do think that it's interesting that, when I go over to eBay and I look at this comic book and I look for new listings, there are some people out there that are, actively selling this book. We have maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 new listings for this book coming off the heels of this announcement. And I would say that on a regular day for a Silver Age book like this, maybe you could see 2, maybe 3. I think 7 definitely shows that there's a lot of people out there that are thinking, oh, this Batgirl movie's not happening. Now is the time to sell the book. I got to get off of this thing. But my overall thesis is that if you're someone who was specking on this character and now you're thinking like, oh, great, there's not going to be a movie. This book is definitely going to drop off, the cliff and it's going to go down. I actually don't necessarily think that that's going to happen. I mean, I think that there will be a pullback, and if there's not enough pop cultural relevance, or if there's not enough, potential excitement for the particular book, it'll certainly find a new floor. But, I think that that floor ultimately will be higher than that of what the floor could be if the movie came out and it was terrible. I think that would actually hurt the values of the book even more so than having no film. So let's take a look at a couple examples of stuff and see if we can kind of, make some determinations of how, good films can protect values of books versus bad films, which actually hurt values of books. And one of the things I want to look at is, the books that basically have had relevance over this last year or so with regards to phase 4 or where we currently are in DC, and see if we can make any good takeaways of this. So one of the books I like to point to is Amazing Spider-Man 14, because this is the first appearance of the Green Goblin. We had the Spider-Man 3 film, which I would say of all of the Marvel phase 4 stuff that has come out this year has widely been accepted as the best movie or property that we've got. I think we can all sort of agree that the last Spider-Man film, generally speaking, has been the most beloved by the widest audience. So I think that this is a good book to, analyze in terms of its value, because obviously we can't look at AF-15 prices because that's a whole other ballgame, but we can think about, okay, Green Goblin was in the last Spider-Man film. Generally speaking, people loved the film. What is the value of this current book today? So as we dig into the numbers for this one, we'll take a look here. I like to always, like I said, pull up the grades that have higher census count. So I look at a book like this, 1964 4.0. We can see that there have been a few sales. And here we see that, this book in the months of December when Spider-Man came out, was selling at a high of $2,900. And like things do after the film, it definitely had a little bit of a pullback, a little bit of a correction, but not too much overall. I mean, we went from 2,600 as a 12-month moving average to 2,500 as a 90-day. Now, this is just the 4.0 grade, but if we look here, generally speaking, when we look at the grade values that have higher census counts, we can see a healthy correction, but not necessarily a falling off the cliff, so to speak. I think there are a couple examples here, say at the 3.0, where we go 2,200 to 1,750. So, a little bit more drastic of a fall off, and certainly the graph looks pretty bad, but I think that has a lot to do with literally the one recent sale here of 1,500. But if we take that away, we can see that generally speaking, this is still a book that sells anywhere from that $2,200 to $2,500 range. So, something that has had a healthy correction, but generally speaking has not fallen off the cliff. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that A, it's a top tier book. People are always going to want to collect this. B, everybody loved the Spider-Man film. And so the value in the brand has overall been protected. And that's one of the reasons that this book has been able to maintain its value. But this is not the only book I want to look at. I mean, let's look at a couple other books really quickly, just to establish books that have been able to maintain their overall value due to the success of their properties. And we have to look to a show like Peacemaker, which I would also say as a DC property was probably the highest received TV show or movie that DC has put out, in the last few years or so. I mean, I think you can make the argument that Suicide Squad was also in that running, but generally speaking, I think audiences really, really liked Peacemaker. And I think the book's values are very reflective of the success of that show. So Fighting Five, number 5, or the first appearance of Peacemaker, kind of hard to analyze that one because there's such a small sample size. This one right here, Peacemaker number 1, first solo series for Peacemaker, also an extremely small sample size. But we can look at it as just a general rule to see, how this book has performed after the fact. So, right when we're going into the show on January of the 20th right here in 2022, we can see that there's a $700 sale. Then sometime after the show, we have slash price of $700 in June. Here in July, we have a book that went for $600. And so generally speaking, even though that this book has had a correction, like many books do after the show, I wouldn't say that this book has, necessarily fallen off the cliff, so to speak. So our 90 day is $575 versus our 12 month, which is $616. So overall, this book has been able to keep it together pretty well. Additionally, we have New Teen Titans Annual number 2. This is the first appearance of Vigilante, a breakthrough character of the Peacemaker show. This is definitely a book that also, even though it's had its correction and the graph might look a little extreme, we can see that, the actual correction isn't that much overall. So here are the 9.8 grades for this thing. And yes, it looks like pretty dire as far as it going up and down. But if we think about, the values of the 90 day at 292 versus the 12 month at 297, and we're just kind of taking general averages, this book actually has held up pretty decently well. I mean, certainly it's had its pullback, it's had its correction. Being a copper age book, it's going to do that. But if we compare it to where it was in January, selling at that $300 level, and now maybe it's selling anywhere from, here's the low recently at $213, but we've had some recent sales at $295, $307, $225. So, this is a book that I would say overall has held up its values pretty decently. And that is in comparison to, some of the other things that I want to show you guys later on, in just a second here. So basically where I'm going with this is that, we've seen so far that when books, whether they be Silver Age books or Copper Age books or, whatever the case may be, if they are associated to a property that people really like, even if there is a pullback, even if there is a correction after the show, I would make the argument that the floor definitely holds pretty strong because there's still enough people that are converted into fans. So when we think to Detective Comics 359, we're thinking about Batgirl. If this film was going to come out and it was going to be a good film and people generally would like it, I think that there would be a correction after the film, but I think the value and the floor value for the book would hold pretty strong. But what happens if this film comes out and people didn't love it and the brand was actually damaged? What would that actually do to the values of those books? Well, let's, hop in here and take a look with Swaggle here. So I actually have quite a few examples that I want to talk about, but let's first talk about this one right here, Tales of Suspense 52. Now I want to focus on this book because I think this is a really interesting case study. Tales of Suspense 52, of course, first appearance of Black Widow, a fantastic book in my opinion. I mean, this is an absolute great blue chip book to get your hands on. I would actually say that this is probably a great time to buy this book. But we all know that, last year we got the Black Widow film and, overall, I think the sentiment was that the film was underwhelming. I think that that is a fair thing to say. I think that actually acts 1 and 2 weren't that bad. I think act 3 kind of fell apart, but let's take a look at some of the values for this one. And this one I think is really interesting because I think you have to look at this one in comparison to say that of Amazing Spider-Man 14, where if you start to look at some of the values, not only do you see a pullback, but you do actually see this book drop off pretty heavily. I mean, even more so than that of what we saw with ASM 14. And I think you can make the argument when you just sort of look at these graphs, just to give you guys a snapshot, I think you can make the argument that people are thinking, well, the Black Widow character is done. We're never going to see her again. And that might be true, although we're totally going to see her again. But I also think that that is true of, the Green Goblin as well. Like we probably won't see him again, although I'm sure at some point in the future, we will see the Green Goblin again. But you can see here when the movie comes out and it's not viewed as highly as, things like Spider-Man number 3, you can see that we have to focus on the 850 number here. This was sort of the 2020, 2021 price when the movie came out, around the $850 range at the 3.5. Now it's $636. So it's had that pullback, but a lot higher of a pullback than that of which we saw with ASM 14. Definitely a higher percentage overall. Additionally, another example that I think we can all guess was something I was going to talk about here was Amazing Spider-Man number 101, first appearance of Morbius, another book that, I would say is a great key book to own in your collection, but one that has been so severely hurt by the reception of the film, it being so negative. I mean, if we look at here the GPA, again, just a higher census grade at the 6.0 range, we can see this book had definitely a steady rise up in the lead up to the film, the anticipation. It had its big a spike here in 2021, held the floor for a while, and then really, really steep decline after the fact. I mean, more so than that, again, of things like the Vigilante book or ASM 14 or things like that. This is more aligned to what we see with the Black Widow book, where this book has a pretty steady rise and a really steep decline after the fact. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that the brand of the book, the reception of the film was just not high enough to able to create a support floor for itself. Additionally, ASM 361, I think this is a great book to compare to that of, say, the Vigilante book, where you can see here in 2021, 924 was the typical moving average for the 9.8 grade. 90-day moving is now down to 500. So this is a 50% drop off, in terms of the book's values, where we're seeing the Vigilante book. I mean, it's definitely had a correction, maybe 25 to 30% or so, but it's not quite at the 50% drop off that we see with Carnage here. Similarly, we can talk about Thor, God of Thunder #2, first appearance of the Gore the God Butcher, another book that has had a massive swing, being a modern book, where you can see that this book, 2021 moving average was 513 right here. And now in the 90-day moving average, it's down to 318. In fact, the last sale was actually 185. So now the book is actually selling at a price that is lower than the price that it was actually selling for before we even knew that Gore the God Butcher was coming. So, when we go back to Detective Comics number 359, we sort of ask ourselves the question, does the cancellation of this movie, is that going to hurt the book? Well, in my opinion, if the film was actually as bad as apparently it was going to be, this is actually a good thing for anyone who is holding on to this book or anyone who is a fan of Barbara Gordon Batgirl, because as we've seen from some of these examples, the book's values could definitely go down after the movie. But if we're kind of in this purgatory state where we don't know if there's going to be a film, I mean, a lot of speculation is still going to exist that maybe Warner Brothers will do another film. And I actually think that, speculation purgatory is a safer place to be for a book's value than to be, after the movie, after the fact, because, definitely the anticipation of a successful film can be a lot more valuable than what we actually see with the results. Because, at some point in the future, we will see Batgirl, on the silver screen in some kind of way. It does seem like DC is sort of reorganizing. They're kind of creating their 10-year plan. And I'm sure that Batgirl will eventually be a part of that. And, really for, comic book holders out there, it's very, very important with, having all these properties in these movies that these characters and their brands are protected. And it definitely seems like that's what DC wants to do. And if that's the case, I actually think you're better off for it if you're someone who owns Detective Comics number 359. Anyways, that's all for this video. Let me know what you guys think. What do you guys think about this cancellation? What do you guys think about what Warner Brothers doing right now? Drop me a like, comment, subscribe if you're enjoying the content, and I will see you in the next video.